So our presenters today are Derissa Vincentini and Vincent Tassa. Derissa is the Community Science Coordinator and GIS Lead at the Ontario Invasive Species Centre in Sault Ste. Marie, where she coordinates invasive species education and outreach initiatives. And that promotes community action to mitigate the spread of invasive species within Canada. She also plays a supportive role in many projects involved with mapping invasive species, Indigenous support and engagement, invasive plants, and hemlock woolly adelgid. Derissa has a background as a forest research technician and a BSc in biology, as well as a certificate in geomatics from Algoma University. And Vince is a program development intern at the Invasive Species Centre, where he provides outreach and training support on forestry-related pests, including the release of the Oak Wilt Wire quarterly newsletter. Vince is a graduate of the Natural Environment Technologist Conservation and Management Program from Sioux College and an executive member of the Sioux Naturalists. So with that, I will turn it over to Derissa.
Awesome, thank you. So yes, and I know that you've had a presentation from us already, Maddie and Vince, so you'll recognize Vince maybe from the previous presentation in March. He's just going to get the slides going up here. And we'll split the presentation kind of similarly to that one. So thank you for having us again for a second time. We're really excited to share our knowledge and also help you as woodlot owners to know what's out there, what to keep an eye out for, and also what you can do about everything. So of course, if you have questions, as Greg mentioned, there's the Q&A box. But even after the hour is done, you could always reach out to us at the Invasive Species Center as well. So we'll begin with very briefly, I know you already had a presentation on invasive forest pests, but I find forest pests are kind of very they're obvious. They're obvious that they're invasive. Whereas plants get a little bit, there's more of a spectrum, I would say, of what is invasive and what isn't, and what could be and what might not be, and all of that. So we're going to do a very brief introduction on invasive species before we get into the specific plants, just so that we're all on the same page. So you can proceed to the next two slides, Vince. So very quickly, what is an invasive species? An invasive species, of course, as we all know, is something that isn't here. It's introduced from outside of its native range. But the second thing that involves an invasive species is that it has to cause harm within its newly introduced range. So not all non-native species are inherently considered invasive, and that's key, especially when we talk about plants. So it has to negatively impact the ecology, the economy, or the society in its newly introduced range to actually be considered invasive. And typically, they actually impact all three of these things. So there's a bunch of different characteristics. Next slide, please, Vince, that make these species so good at invading. Typically, they're fast growing, they reproduce really quickly, they lack natural predators that would normally slow their spread in the native range. The target native species, or in the case of plants, a lot of times it's really the species that they're sharing space with, lack natural defense mechanisms, or don't know how to compete with them. And invasive species typically have an increased tolerance and adaptive capacity to new and changing conditions, which is especially important when we start talking about climate change as well on the landscape. Next slide, please. So in Ontario, we actually have more invasive species than any other province in Canada. And more specifically, in Southern Ontario, it has the highest concentration of invasive species. Next slide. And this is typically because of a the world that we live in today, which allows for a lot of movement on the landscapes. So whether it's international trading, shipments of goods, or travel as individuals. So when this increases, it comes with a lot of positives and pros, but it also poses challenges such as invasive species. So the reason for Ontario being the highest concentration of invasive species in Canada is simply because of the many ports of entry, both by individuals and travel centers, but also for shipments of goods and international trading. And then once on the landscape, all of those ports are also in the most highly concentrated and population of people in Canada as well. So once they're on the landscape, they have a higher risk of being moved on that landscape as well. And how do they move on that landscape? So first, it's natural means of spread, especially with plants. We know like they have wind dispersal mechanisms, they attach to animals, and they move in various ways like that. So birds can spread invasive species, etc. But there's also industrial means of spread. Vince, can you click through a couple of pictures here? Awesome, thank you. So there's also industrial means of spread as well. So through excavation, heavy machinery, even logging equipment, things like that. We know shipments. So ballast water can contribute to invasive species spread, different things like that. And then there's also kind of ways that general members of the public, including you and I, could potentially spread these species by accident. A lot of times, especially with plants, those seeds can attach to our clothing. They can be hiding inside the dirt that's in our boots. Um, Little examples like that. We know that the movement of firewood could harbor insects underneath the bark that we don't know is there. Also, just improper disposal of garden waste can contribute to the spread of invasive species, especially plants. So just a little quick kind of introduction of how these species are moving on the landscape, why they're here, and what we consider invasive. Um, so this next slide is the invasion curve, and it depicts kind of as the longer that an invasive species is on the landscape and its population grows, the more time consuming and the more costly it is to eradicate it and or manage it. And also the more um, negative impacts it will pose on the landscape. So typically we try to target prevention, so preventing those species from getting here, or even once they're here in Ontario, moving to new locations, so preventing them from that movement, or species arrival and catching them as soon as they're here so that it doesn't become as costly, whether it is through management or through those negative impacts. So now we have a basic overview of that introduction. We'll get into some of those species. So the first one we're going to talk about is garlic mustard. It is an edible herb native to Europe, and it's considered one of Ontario's most aggressive forest invaders and threatens biodiversity. Its most identifiable feature is actually the fresh smell of garlic, which is actually why it was introduced to Canada and North America because it can make a really, really good pesto. So when you crush the leaves, you can really, really smell that potent garlic smell, but the younger leaves are even more potent as well. It is a biennial plant, so there is a 2-year life cycle. And on the next slide, you'll see the first year plant, where it'll kind of really put its energy into the underground root system and develop that strong root system to overwinter. And it creates those clusters of basal rosettes, and they show up in these little tiny kind of kidney bean shaped leaves, similar to native violets. Um, and then in the second year, it will shoot up a stem or a stalk and create these triangle shaped leaves, white flowers. And then once it's done flowering, it will develop a bean pod kind of shaped, pod that holds all of its seeds. So garlic mustard can definitely be problematic. Within 5 to 7 years, garlic mustard can enter, establish, and become the dominant plant in the forest understory, doubling its population size every 4 years. So one dense stand can spread 60,000 viable seeds per square meter, which means it can spread quite rapidly. Now, some of the ecological impacts that you'll notice through a lot of these invasive plants is almost all of them will outcompete their native species that they're sharing space with. A lot of them may specifically uh, pose impacts to species at risk. So with garlic mustard, it typically likes the same habitat as American ginseng, which is a species at risk for various other reasons. But of course, the invasion of garlic mustard certainly doesn't help. A lot of these plants also have allelopathic characteristics, which means that they disperse chemicals into the soil that can prevent or inhibit the growth of other plants and grasses. And sometimes these chemicals also deter animals from eating the plants as well. So they can remove food sources from our native or our animals that are foraging and looking for food on the landscape. And they can thrive in a very wide variety of conditions, and garlic mustard is no exception to this. It will thrive in shade, sunlight, and just completely take over the understory floor. So the next slide, we'll talk very briefly about management of garlic mustard. Most invasive plant management will require you over your return to the site, follow up. Some of the plants you might even need to go back more than once per year for management, so that it becomes very time consuming and intense, but it is possible. So with garlic mustard, especially if you have a smaller population, you can actually manually control it by just grabbing the plant at the base of the stem, right at the soil level, and trying to remove the entire tap root. And it has like an S shape to it, so you have to remove that entire root. Otherwise, it might just grow back. So if you can go back more than once in a season, then you can go back and get any of those where the root broke off. It's typically easier after a rainfall because of the taproot. It can get into some pretty compact soil, so it makes it a little bit difficult to pull. But if you can plant it after rainfall, that can really loosen the soil and help. If you are focusing on especially manual removal, then focusing on outlying populations or the edges of the main population and working your way inward will kind of help for prevention into the future years. So if you can't get the entire population, using that will help prevent it from spreading even further the next year and the next year, and then eventually you'll get down to the main population. And the best time to actually manage garlic mustard is mid-May, so kind of coming up right now. I know there's been a couple garlic mustard pulls planned in Sault Ste. Marie. One already happened and one's coming up. So, the time is now for garlic mustard because you want to do it before it goes to seed, which happens in about early to mid-June. The nice thing about garlic mustard, it is one of the first green plants on the landscape, which actually make it quite easy to identify, so that you can start planning for pulls. The seeds are also viable for up to 5 to 7 years. So even if you are removing those plants and if you don't have any new seed introduction, then you want to make sure that you're going back year over year for at least 7 years still, just to make sure that that seed bank is completely depleted. They're very robust. That's what makes them invasive. So next on the next slide, there's a map, a distribution map from the Quinte area, and this is just showing what has been reported in the area. It doesn't mean that there aren't other locations that have garlic mustard. But since its introduction to North America, or Canada at least, garlic mustard has spread throughout Ontario, parts of Quebec, and established populations in Western and Atlantic Canada as well. So it's largely spread across the landscape. But there's still municipalities or woodlots or parks that actually have no garlic mustard. So if you think back to that invasion curve that I showed, a lot of these species, although they're widespread across the landscape, you can think about a newer introduction or preventing the introduction um, on a smaller scale as well. So say within your own woodlot, you can manage a smaller site or prevent the introduction into that site. So it's still worth managing, I guess is all I'm trying to get at. All right, so we're gonna get into common buckthorn. It is a woody shrub species native to Europe, which is why it's often called European buckthorn, if you've also heard of that. It is shade and drought tolerant and grows in a wide range of habitats, including roadsides, fence lines, um, woodlot edges, and in pastures and abandoned fields, so pretty much anywhere. It can reach heights up to 6 to 7 meters, but it usually actually taps out around 3 meters. Again, it could also be easily identified as it's kind of one of the first plants that, or bushes, especially like woody plants that leaf out in the spring. And it also holds on to its leaves a lot later into the fall compared to most of our native plants. Other identifying features include that the leaves are sharp and pointed and often kind of curved or almost like folded into themselves. and they have somewhat finely rounded teeth. But the main kind of identifying feature of the leaves is that if you kind of flip it over, it's easier to see that there's 3 to 5 strongly curved veins that kind of curve right up until to the tip of the leaf. The flowers are greenish yellow and grow in really, really dense clusters. And then the fruits, as they mature, they're black. But in the picture, you see them as green, and that's what color they are when they're immature. And mature branches will also end in a really sharp thorn or terminal spine. So you want to be careful of that if you're kind of working in and amongst any buckthorn stands. And the last point that I want to make on the introduction of common buckthorn is that it is listed as a noxious weed in under Ontario's Weed Control Act as well. So it is a regulated species under that act. Next slide, please, Vince. Thank you. So common buckthorn can harm biodiversity in a number of ways. Firstly, their berries are actually purgative, so they're laxatives when they're ingested. And many birds love eating these berries still. So they'll eat them, immediately excrete them, and then that contributes to the spread of this shrub on the landscape. And since the berries don't stay in their digestive system very long, the birds don't typically obtain any kind of nutrition or any value from them. It also is another allelopathic species, so it affects soil quality by changing that nitrogen composition, which makes it more difficult for other species to survive. These changes can even have long-lasting effects on that soil, so even after you've removed or managed buckthorn, species still may have a difficult time growing in that soil. For example, pin cherry or choke cherry, whose berries do provide benefit to our native wildlife, have difficulty surviving where this soil chemistry has been changed from buckthorn. Common buckthorn seems to also have a direct impact on understory plant communities and vegetation types, so choking out vegetation for resources such as sunlight and alterations to the soil chemistry. So this can actually impact forest industry as buckthorn forms kind of even age dense stands dominating the understory. And as those canopies open, like we've seen with emerald ash borer and ash trees on the landscape, especially in southern Ontario, then it's just buckthorn underneath, and it doesn't allow for um, natural forest regeneration to occur. Um, yes, I got all of that. Cool. All right, so we'll get into a bit of management of buckthorn. When the soil is moist, some of the small plants, so up to about 1 meter in height, can actually just be like hand pulled. Larger plants can be dug out or pulled by using a weed wrench tool. One of the kind of common ones is called an extractigator. And it helps ensure that you're getting all of the roots underneath that plant. Because resprouting can occur if not all of the roots are removed. Or there's additional measures like fire or chemical control as well. So if pulling takes place in the fall, care should be taken to kind of remove all of those berries because they'll still be on the trees. So either remove them or contain them with bags or something until it's all been removed. However, fall, I don't want to discourage management in the fall because it's actually a great time to manage, either in the fall or the winter before the ground freezes. And that's because all of kind of our native plants have gone dormant on the landscape. So you're kind of limiting the damage that you have to our native vegetation. And as I mentioned, the leaves stay on longer than other plants. So it's just easier to identify and not accidentally maybe remove some other plants that are on the landscape. You can also cut or girdle larger stems. There are mechanisms for doing this without chemical control. It just is more labor intensive and you have to go back like time and time again. However, coupled with herbicide to prevent kind of regrowth is very, very successful. So you can either spray or paint onto the stump. There's a couple different chemicals that are approved for that. If you have a bunch of smaller plants that are popping up, then you can do repeated mowing to reduce the stem numbers and vigor, and eventually it would kill most seedlings. But again, that's kind of like every 2 weeks or once a month you're mowing that location and for a couple of years in a row. So it does eventually work to kind of smother out the underground root system and storage, just very labor and time intensive. And then again, another distribution map for buckthorn. Next slide, please, Vince. Thank you. It is found from Nova Scotia to about Alberta, and then it's just in a couple communities past Alberta, like in BC, I guess. Uh, in Ontario, it is widespread across southern Ontario, and then kind of just in like Sault Ste. Marie, Sudbury, Thunder Bay, like the larger communities in northern Ontario. As you can see, it's quite widespread in the Quinte area. Um, so I imagine this is something that many of you probably are dealing with, but we do have a bunch of resources on our website to help with that, and we'll get into where to find those afterwards. But the last thing I want to mention before I pass it over to Vince, just about these maps, is they're all taken from EdMaps, which is a tool that you can use to either report any findings of invasive species that you find, or even to look up these distribution maps and kind of even zoom in around your property or something to see what might be on the landscape nearby. And with that, I'll pass it on to Vince to talk about some other species.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Derissa. So I'm going to be jumping into dog strangling vine. So this is another species that I'm sure many of you are aware of. Every time that I visit Southern Ontario and I go to public parks, I usually see this plant within the landscape. So I'm sure it's one that many of you are quite familiar with. So there's actually two different species of dog strangling vine that are in Ontario and are regulated as restricted under the Ontario Invasive Species Act. The other one being black dog strangling vine, but just for this presentation, we're going to focus on the main dog strangling vine that is commonly seen, as it is a little bit more problematic and a lot more prominent on the landscape. So it is a woody rootstock native to Eurasia. It's also known as the European swallowwort, or pale swallowwort as well. And both the species of dog strangling vine are members of the milkweed family. And as I had mentioned, they are both restricted under the Ontario Invasive Species Act. So this plant is commonly recognized as a climbing vine. So you'll see it usually growing around other plants and spreading out like that. It can typically reach up to a height of 2 meters before it bends back over onto itself, just from the weight of the dense mats that it has created. So it has these smooth green oval or oblong shaped leaves, and they are wavy at the margins and rounded at the base. So the way that I usually identify this is from the flowers. They're star shaped. If any of you are familiar with the children's cartoon show SpongeBob SquarePants, the flowers to me look like Patrick Star, just the little pink star shape or starfish. So that's how I commonly identify this plant. And also from its long bean pods that contain the feathered seeds. And when those open, they also are really reminiscent of the seed pods that the other common milkweed plants produce. But one of the reasons why this plant is problematic is because it actually attracts the monarch butterfly that is currently listed as endangered in Canada, which is required for the monarch to successfully complete its reproductive life cycle. So unfortunately, the monarch butterflies will land on the dog strangling vine plants and lay their eggs. And then once those hatch, they don't provide the appropriate food source for them to complete their life cycle. So it's especially problematic for that species at risk. And as you can see in the picture here, it within a forested setting, it can completely overtake the understory, which will shade out the native species, and then end up producing a monocrop stand. So it's not good from the purpose of, or from the standpoint of biological diversity. And it's also problematic for regenerating forests as well. So especially in mature forests, where the seedling or the saplings underneath would be growing to replace the mature trees that have died off. This produces a lot of shade, and so it shades out the saplings, and they're not able to grow and reach maturity themselves. So it just ends up taking over the entire understory of the forest. But it also displaces a lot of animals like ground-dwelling birds and birds that require the understory to survive, and can also discourage other mammals such as deer from entering into specific areas just because of those dense mats that they produce. And even from a forestry perspective, can you imagine like walking through, like you can see in the image here, trying to walk through the forest and trying to carry out operations? It's just it just makes it very inaccessible. And so other impacts as well, the social impacts. So it can also overtake walking trails, making it difficult to walk through. And yeah. And this plant as well is also allelopathic, just like the garlic mustard. So it releases a chemical within the soil that will discourage other nearby plants from forming. And so it can also have problems in that way as well. So in terms of managing, so the focus is really should be given to areas where prolific seed pod growth is likely to occur. So those are areas with a high amount of sunlight and the densest growth of the plant. So those areas are the ones that should be targeted the most. And as with a lot of other invasive species for managing, once you've removed the plant, it is recommended that you replace the plants that are removed with native vegetation. But in terms of managing the plant itself, if you're going for eradication, the most effective method seems to be the digging up of the root crown itself and making sure that you are getting most and all of the roots. Otherwise, it can regenerate. And it's also important to pay attention to in the following years to make sure that other dog strangling vine plants aren't sprouting up from seeds that could have set within the soil. So it's important once you've removed the plant to follow up year after year, just to make sure that seeds that were missed or that ended up surviving in the soil aren't producing more plants. Mowing is another effective method as well. It can, but it has been shown that it can, that the plant can resprout rapidly and potentially still produce flowers and seeds. But timed mowing can be an effective way to reduce the amount of seed that is produced. Even though this method will not specifically eradicate the population, it is an effective way at managing so that it's not getting worse. Clipping is another method that can be used as well and should be done later in the growing season. And it can be effective at reducing the seed production. And it should be done just after the plants flower and before the seed pods are produced. Pulling is another method that can be done, but pulling can be a little bit problematic because the vines themselves are not really robust and they can snap, and it'll leave the root crown behind. And that will allow for the plant to be able to reestablish. So pulling, although it might seem effective, it is important to make sure that you are actually removing the root crown itself. And then finally, for medium and larger populations, where in the previous slide, there was that image that showed it taking over the understory. Tarping would be used in a situation more like that to manage those really large, dense populations. And that is essentially just covering the entire area where the dog strangling vine is with tarps. And then that will shade out the plant and make sure or ensure that it's not receiving the sunlight that is essential for it to grow. And then eventually over time, it will kill out the plant. And then this map here also shows the distribution within the Quinte area, just like the other slides. So again, this is another plant that's very prolific. Again, most of you are probably very familiar with it. And yeah, it's quite widespread throughout southern Ontario. There are also known infestations who have been found adjacent to Lake Erie in Ontario, and other well-established populations in the Ottawa area. Yeah, and it has been reported as far north as Temagami. So the next plant I want to highlight is Japanese knotweed. So this is a plant that is native to Asia, and it was originally planted as an ornamental and was used to stabilize river banks to prevent erosion, although this plant has been proven to not actually be effective at preventing erosion. And the way that it is to identify this one is from its alternating leaves. And for myself, one of the ways that I easily identify this plant is from the pointed tips and the flat base of the leaves. And then it ends up growing these white-green sprays of flowers starting in late August. They're kind of gentle looking flowers and they're pretty. It grows quite an intricate root system. The roots themselves can penetrate quite deep into the soil, up to depths of about 5 meters. So this makes the plant particularly difficult to manage just because of that extensive root system. And the seeds, or the plant itself, it reproduces not necessarily from the seeds, but more so via the rhizomes that it produces. And so the fact that those roots do penetrate so deeply, it makes it definitely much more difficult to manage from that standpoint of it being able to reproduce from the root system itself. And the stems are hollow. They resemble bamboo. So I've often had people telling me, like, what is this bamboo plant that's growing in my yard? And it's like, yeah, it's probably Japanese knotweed. And this plant itself is now classified as restricted as well under the Ontario Invasive Species Act. So it's definitely a very robust and problematic plant. You can see in that image there that it's penetrating right through asphalt. So this can prove problematic for property owners as well, because it has been documented growing through the foundation of homes if it is growing near the house. But it's also known to degrade the quality of wetland and riparian habitats where it becomes established, and it creates these super dense thickets that shade out approximately 90% of the sunlight that's able to penetrate through. From a social perspective, it can take over an entire area. It is often seen in public parks and along trails. And from an ecological standpoint as well, it just because of the dense mats that the dense stands that it produces, it shades out the native species, leading to another monocrop, and it reduces the overall diversity of the area that it is growing in. And so this picture here, I believe this is from the Sioux. It's from a walking trail here in the city, so you can actually see that most of the leaves in this images are from Japanese knotweed. So when it does take over, it just completely takes over the landscape there. So from a management perspective, so it's a very hardy plant, and it can regenerate from only about a centimeter log fragment of the root for it to reproduce. And again, as I had mentioned earlier, that it reproduces mainly via the rhizomes, which make up approximately 2/3 of the entire plant's biomass. And I think it has been shown that manual control may actually stimulate the growth and increase the density of the plant itself. But as far as control methods go, mowing and cutting, it can be affected, but it needs to be repeated. It'll eventually stress the rhizomes themselves. So it's just a matter of being persistent and cutting back the plant, and returning to it year over year to making sure that you're cutting that back. Digging as well. So this one it's difficult, it's costly because the roots do penetrate quite deep into the soil. You would have to dig quite deep to get all of the roots. This is quite effective when the plants are younger and they haven't really established well, because it is more likely that you're able to dig out most of the roots itself. And then again, tarping to be used for larger, dense patches of the plant, and that has to be completed over multiple seasons to be successful in making sure that you're getting all of it. And herbicide stem injection is used as well, but obviously appropriate herbicide application protocols should be followed when doing that. But that has been shown to also be effective.
Before you move on, Vince, just
Yep.
very, very quickly, I should have mentioned it to you beforehand. There's a lot of research emerging on Japanese knotweed management right now. So our current best management practice is a little bit out of date. So even with herbicide spray, it is recommended to also do like spraying the vegetation, not just stem injections. Now there's some moving parts there as research emerges, but we're hoping to get a new best management practice out hopefully next year. But yeah, just to know that there is some moving parts there. So you could always get in touch with us if you're looking for more information.
Oh, for sure. Thanks for that clarification, Derissa. And as with many of the other invasive species, management is most effective when you combine different management practices. So when we're listing all of these different ones individually, I think it's important too to keep in mind that multiple management practices can be used. You don't just have to pick one specific one. Then obviously that changes depending on the situation and the different types of management that suits your needs. And then this map here again, just to show the distribution within the Quinte area. So again, it is quite widespread, but important to keep in mind that these are only of reports that have been submitted, and it's likely that there could be more than this, but definitely widespread. The last species that I'm going to touch upon here are giant hogweed and wild parsnip, more so focused on giant hogweed, but wild parsnip as well, just because of the similarities that they possess. So this one here, it's a perennial herbaceous plant, and it is in the carrot family. This one can grow really, really tall. It typically up to 3 to 5 meters, but in ideal conditions can go up to 18 feet. The leaves are very large, and they're quite spiked. They're compound and jagged in appearance. The stem itself is hollow and rigid, approximately 10 to 15 centimeters in diameter. And one of the key identifying features of the giant hogweed is that the stem is typically covered in these purple spots that you can see on the bottom image there. And then it does produce these very, very large clusters, flowers, which appear in mid-June. But the one thing with the giant hogweed is its sap, that phytotoxic sap that it produces that is quite dangerous. And the sap itself collects on the stiff hairs that grow around the stems, stem and base of the stems itself. So the impacts, so from an economic perspective, so the giant hogweed is often seen growing in fields and pastures. So for the agricultural industry, that can be problematic. Animals that are grazing in the fields, if they are to walk up against the giant hogweed, the sap itself can harm the animals, and it can be a costly plant to control as well. From the social, obviously, the harm from the sap itself. So you can see in the image on the right-hand side of the screen, it's pretty nasty. I haven't experienced this myself, and I really hope to to never come in contact with it. You can see just after time that the effects from the sap are still quite prominent. But the sap that is produced is definitely one of the big problems, and ecologically as well. So because it is such a large plant and it produces such large leaves, again, as with other invasive plants, it can shade out the native vegetation. And this one does emerge quite early in the spring, and in areas where it does emerge, it shades out native spring plants that emerge as well. And then when the plant itself dies back, because it shades out the vegetation around it, it can leave the soil underneath quite barren. So this one here, so this is our native plant, the cow parsnip, but it does look very similar. It's as well a member of the plant family, carrot, sorry, family, and it does contain the same phytotoxic chemicals, but it's much less potent. And it won't grow as tall as the giant hogweed. This one will reach heights typically of 2.5 meters compared to the 3 to 5 meters that the giant hogweed will reach. And then this is wild parsnip. So again, it looks similar. It doesn't grow as tall as again, and the flowers that it produces are much smaller in relation to the giant hogweed, and they're yellow in color. So just to be able to show you how to differentiate, but this one is invasive as well, and it does contain the same toxic materials, just not in the same quantity as the giant hogweed. And this map here, just to show you the distribution, so it is quite widespread as well in that area and the Quinte area, not as much as the other plants. And the same with wild parsnip. So very quickly, in terms of management for this plant, so it's really important that protective clothing is worn because of that phytotoxic sap. So that's making sure that you're wearing long sleeves, shirts, pants, and eye protection, because it can also cause blindness if it gets into your eye. So the management should take place in early spring when the plants are still quite small and haven't grown to their full size. Hand pulling and digging seems to be the most effective on the younger plants. It is recommended that you don't use motorized tools like weed whackers because it can actually spread the sap and kind of send it flying around. So you definitely don't want to do that. Herbicide application is another method as well that can be used, and that should be done when the leaves are fully expanded in the spring and early summer. And the herbicide treatment itself is not effective once the plant begins flowering. So in the bottom there, you can see the person wearing full protective gear, digging out the plants. And then on the right-hand side, those are plants that have been treated with herbicide. And as with our the other invasive species, more resources and best management practices can be found on our website. And then very quickly, I'm just going to cover invasive ground cover plants. So common plants that are used for ground cover that are sold in garden centers and nurseries, goutweed, yellow archangel, and periwinkle. So these ones, if they are able to escape, will actually spread across the landscape and become quite prominent. This picture, I believe here, was also taken in Sault Ste. Marie, and I think this might have been from yard waste that was dumped. So it's just to show how, and actually it's all three of the species in one place, but just to show how much it can spread and become quite prolific there. And then I'll pass it back over to Derissa.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so now we're just going to very quickly go over some of the things that you can do and some of the resources that are available to you. So firstly, I want to just touch on kind of the importance of community sciences. And even as woodlot owners, you are kind of deemed community scientists, or at least stewards of the land. So I just want to touch on it a little bit. I assume that many of you, well, are woodlot owners, but also are outside in the natural environment quite often. So you're really more likely to notice any changes that are on the landscape or in that environment that could be caused by invasive species. So community science data can be very messy, but the real value is really in that increasing education and outreach with the public or community members like yourselves, and have that chance to be involved and contribute to wider issues. Community science is an opportunity for that collaboration between the public, property owners, and the scientific community, as well as regulatory bodies, so all levels of government as well. It's really a cost-effective way to collect important data, gain access to new areas, especially in private or on private property, and cover more areas by just having more people participate. Community members such as yourselves can actually contribute to important research and monitoring. So we have community science programs for monitoring for hemlock woolly adelgid right now, where we're working with researchers that's going to use that data, just as an example. And really just the more trained eyes and boots on the ground through the power of community science and community awareness that we have, the quicker that we can act and react to eradicate maybe a new introduction or limit the spread and impact of existing invasive species on the landscape. So just as an example, to demonstrate the power of community science, on the next slide, please, Vince. And how much community members can make a difference. This is a case study of Asian longhorn beetle, which is not currently in Ontario, but it has been before. So a community member found it on the hood of their car in Toronto, and they recognized it from a billboard and said, hey, I saw this before, and I think that I was supposed to report it. So they reported a picture of it on their car, and it resulted in a rapid response from all levels of government to quickly survey the area, create a quarantine zone of 150 kilometers squared where they removed all infested or at-risk trees. And they effectively managed the pest before it had a chance to escape out of the city and into natural forests. So this was a very successful. It was first found in 2003 in Toronto. It was declared officially eradicated in 2007, but then a second population was found in Mississauga in 2013 by one tree that was missed in a very industrial area. And then they did the same protocol, and it's been since deemed eradicated and nothing else has been found. So community members can really play a huge role in preventing or managing and especially monitoring for these invasive species within communities and on your own woodlots in the area, neighboring areas. So how do you report invasive species if you do see them? There's multiple different ways, and I just say like report anywhere, any way that you can, whatever you're comfortable with. EdMaps is a great platform. It is an app form for your phone or tablet, but you can also report on its web version as well. But it is very specific to invasive species and invasive species only. So this is where we extracted all of those distribution maps today. But there's another platform called iNaturalist. If you aren't familiar with it, it is for anything. So you can use it as a tool to learn about your natural environment around you, both native, invasive, non-native, whatever you have around you. And it even has tools to help you identify the species that are around you too. So we do use iNaturalist quite a bit as well for invasive species reports. And then if you're less comfortable with the kind of technology side of things, there's always a phone number as well. So we have the invasive species hotline that you can call as well. And all of these things, there's a number of different reasons to report, but I think I mentioned it already. It's also a tool for you to use. So you can look at these maps afterwards and see like what's in your area and what you might be on the lookout for more. So the next slide, a couple different ways we talked a little bit about how individuals could accidentally spread invasive species on the landscape. So here's some of those habits that we could implement as individuals just in our day-to-day lives to prevent that spread. Cleaning our boots, clothes, and outdoor gear from hitchhiking plant seeds when we're kind of between trails or between sites. Buy and burn local firewood to avoid spreading insects and pathogens. When it's possible, consider choosing native plants in your garden. Not only they might be low maintenance because they have learned to survive our climate, but they also contribute greatly to pollinators and birds and other members of the ecosystem. Don't transport plants or soil over long distances, kind of similarly to firewood, but it's not really talked about as much. And the reason I kind of like to use Japanese knotweed as that example, because as Vince was mentioning, you only need 1 centimeter piece of root for it to start a new population. So if you're moving soil that could be contaminated with that, for just as one example, then you're going to start and spread that species on the landscape. And now we're also seeing like the spread of jumping worms through the movement of soil and plants and other species like that. And although not necessarily relevant to this talk, in case there's some kind of crossover enthusiasts in the water body pathway, it's also important to not dump your bait in the water. So the rule of thumb is 30 meters on shore. You want to buy locally sourced bait if possible. Clean, drain, and dry your boat when transporting it over land. So the cleaning and draining part is actually law now under the Invasive Species Act before moving your boat to another water body. And I also invite you to encourage these actions kind of at your organization events as well. So, create a means for your attendees to do these things easily, maybe by eliminating barriers. For example, like having boot brushes available at your woodlot visits or, handheld boot brushes. Do I have one here? I do. I got it. I just use like a little household cleaning brush that I keep in my truck, and then I use that to clean my boots. And once I put it in my truck, it was enough of a reminder for me to do it. I know habits can be difficult, but anything that we can do to help, it works. So yeah, Vince has the Grow Me Instead guide up here. This is a great resource if you are looking for plants in your garden, especially if you live, on the same location as your woodlot. We know that plants don't know boundaries, so they can escape your garden into the natural woodlot or forest environment. So this Grow Me Instead guide is a great resource for which plants are native alternatives to commonly found invasive plants at garden centers. Um, Another prevention method is disposing of garden waste properly, as improper disposal of garden waste can lead to an infestation and spread of invasive species. So the picture on the left is actually a compost pile that is riddled with Himalayan balsam creeping outside of it. And on the right is a bunch of kind of yard clippings that were dumped into a kind of neighboring forest area. And that's Himalayan balsam popping up right in the middle as well. And this is how all those pictures that Vince was showing from Sault Ste. Marie, that's how the plants got there, is from people moving their garden waste into the neighboring forest area. So instead, the general rules for proper disposal of either known invasive material or garden waste that could potentially be invasive, so anything that's not native, is to place all plant parts into construction grade garbage bags, leave it on a hard surface like a deck, driveway, or trailer, and allow it to bake in the sun for at least a week, if not two, and that solarizes that plant material and the seeds before disposing of it in a landfill. So that really kills it off because they're such robust plants. So then lastly, I will leave you with our website, the invasivespeciescentre.ca. There you'll find species profiles for every plant that we talked about today for the most part. There's fact sheets on different plants or general fact sheets like invasive species and climate change, for example. There's best management practices. You can find those on the species profiles, or there's a database even for species that we don't have profiles for. And those are really great resources. They go in detail on the different management options and in which situations each management option would be best suited for. So those are great resources. There's a community science program if you're looking to get involved. We have videos and webinars. You name it, we have it. And if you have suggestions, we're also always open to that. We do have a monthly webinar series, so where we bring experts on to talk about different things. So if you're interested in looking at those webinars or you missed some, we have a YouTube channel where all of those can be found as well. And I think that's it. I know we're a little bit over time, but we're happy to stay on to answer a couple questions. And I also mentioned that you can always get in touch with us afterwards if we either don't get to them or something pops in your head afterwards, because I know that happens to me a lot. So thank you again for having us.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we have a couple of questions. One from Frank, and he asked about spraying for dog strangling vine.
Yeah, absolutely. Vincent, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but they're in that best management practice. It does go into herbicide control for dog strangling vine. I don't know the specifics off the top of my head, but it will tell you what what is recommended in terms of chemicals, concentrations, time of year, all of those types of things. But you also have to be sure to check the label of the pesticide that you are using as well. The best management practices are based on research and are not meant to be used as your kind of guide to what is maybe legal or regulated in Ontario or Canada. So make sure you're always kind of referencing both. One's for the plant, one's for the chemical. So referencing your pesticide labels as well.
And I guess while we're talking about herbicides, I know for buckthorn, for example, 7 was approved, and there's another biological control method, but both of those require somebody with a herbicide license, right? So if you're a farmer, you can do it
Yes.
yourself, but otherwise you have to hire somebody to do that, correct?
Yes, absolutely. So there are, yeah, pesticides always have to be used by someone with a pesticide license. In many cases, you also have to write a letter of opinion to the Ministry of Environment as well to let them know what you're doing and get approvals. So there is a bit of a process. We don't really work with herbicides very much ourselves, but if you're looking for questions specifically around herbicides and like going through what you need to do for that, your local Ministry of Environment um, office would be great to get in contact with.
Okay, second, there's a detailed question here. It says, we have an 18-year-old white pine stand, about 10 acres. Blister rust has spread quickly and maybe 25% of the trees have it. How would you suggest we mitigate the damage? They're considering cutting out every third row for easier access and management. Is that something you guys can answer, or do you want
Wow.
Mm,
Um,
good
I'm
question.
actually not super familiar with management for blister rust. I actually worked on a couple blister rust trials when I worked at Ontario Forest Research Institute. But I'm not familiar with management guidance for that fungus. I know that they've worked on like genetic trials for replanting white pine that is resistant to the pest, but I'm not sure. There might be silviculture suggestions, which sounds like that might be what they're suggesting when they say they're cutting out every third row, and that's to kind of allow for probably more airflow in the understory and limiting how quickly the fungus can find a new host and then continue to spread would be my guess. But again, I'm not super familiar, but we could put you in touch with someone who might have more answers.
Okay, or perhaps they can contact a local forester if they can find somebody
Yep,
through the registered forest people.
absolutely.
Third question is, do you need to garbage bag garlic mustard if it's pulled before seeding and it's just flowering?
Our recommendation is yes, mainly just because as you're kind of going along, you never know if there's one plant that might have kind of gone a little bit quicker than the other ones. And sometimes those roots as well might have the ability to withstand kind of compost or anything like that and reroot and regrow within that growing season. Additionally, uh, any soil that's taken up with those roots could have garlic mustard seeds, and those seeds are really what you want to make sure is getting solarized as well. So our rule of thumb is definitely following that best practice. There are species where you don't need to. So one example of where it's not as critical as Himalayan balsam. It is an annual plant and the seeds are only viable for 18 months. So if you get it before it even flowers, then there's no chance of it continuing to even develop seeds. And if you're going back to that same site 2 years in a row, you're likely to eradicate it. But garlic mustard is a little bit more robust, so I'd recommend still following best management practices. There is an option if you're looking to reduce plastic waste, which is definitely a question we get a lot, um, where you can use tarps to kind of get the same efficiency with solarizing, and then you can compost the material or get rid of the material at the landfill after that, where you're reducing the number of plastic bags that you're using.
Okay, and I read something recently on Buckthorn where a person said they were having luck by cutting the tree off. So when you say you cut the stump, then obviously it grows from the stump again, and you can either bag it or herbicide it or something. But he said, I think the ideal was he was going to cut it off at about a 3 foot level and then keep going back every year to trim off the runners that pop
Yes.
up. And he said you had to do that for 3 or 4 years, and then eventually the tree gave up. So I guess if you're
Yep.
in a bush, that might be the way to do it, right? Just
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I mentioned. There are ways of girdling the tree and or cutting it like that, where it is manual, like only manual control without the use of pesticides, which may be an option or a preferred option. It just requires more time and energy to go back year over year or multiple times a year to cut back any new growth. So, um, again, it all comes down to what resources you have, what energy you have, time, all sorts of different things. You might consider if you're managing your own invasive species population, but there are different methods out there. Yes.
looks like all these things are tough, so you got to keep going back year after year to get rid of them. So I feel lucky because I have three of the species you talked about. My neighboring lot has two of them, and there's a couple more that we didn't talk about, like lily of the valley and things like that. So I've got
Right.
lots of work here.
Yeah.
Anyway, guys, I think we'll call it a day. That's it for questions. So thank you very much for presenting to us today. That was very good information. And again, I'll remind everybody, we're looking for a place to host a walk on June 29th. So if you would like to host us and an expert on invasive species and you have a couple on your lot that we can actually look at and maybe figure out how to pull it or get rid of it, you can email us at Quinte Woodlot Association, all one word, at gmail.com. So that's Quinte Woodlot Association at gmail.com. And Vince will send me the link for this webinar. We'll post that with our previous one on insects through the Ontario Woodlot website as well. That'll be up there in a few weeks once I get around to doing it. So once again, guys, thanks much. And
Thank you for having us. It's a
Yeah,
pleasure.
thank you
if
so
we
very
have
much.
questions, we'll give you a shout.
Absolutely. You know how to get a hold of us.
Yep.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Take
Have a
care.
great day, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.